We're good? All right. Do you want to open up today?
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Welcome, work group members, the work group to end all work groups. Thank you so much. We have another heavy meeting, and hopefully we can get to everything, but we want to make sure we do get to everything. So we're going to continue on we're going to pick up where we left off for our last meeting and introduce the next topic that we have. And we'll talk about several things today, but one of the things we're going to talk about, and my co-chair Liz will really hit on it, is a lot of the answers for what needs to be done has been uncovered. And they've been uncovered for a while. And how that's executed, right, is a different question. And so, but there's been plenty of work groups before us who have said what needs to be said to get it done. And so this is a very important topic, and one of the activities that we'll do with you today is how do you overcome barriers to implementation, right? Implementation is where things go to die at times, or many times. And so being able to solve for that is a big deal. And so with everything that we have, there's a whole lot between just the department until you get into a teacher's classroom in a small group. And a lot of things happen between that time. And that's just one layer, right? And then districts have their own bureaucracies as well. So how do we make sure that we get this right? And so today's meeting, I'm really excited. And then we'll also dig into the IEP. And what that is, I always say the IEP made me a damn good teacher. And back in Los Angeles, I used to have class sizes of 36, and half of the kids had IEPs when I first started to teach. These are Los Angeles classroom sizes. And so, I was a first-year teacher, and my partner teacher was a first-year teacher, and I read every single one to the T, and we both, we told ourselves we're not going to get jaded, we're going to do this, and what we did for them served every student well, right? What is in the IP helps other students as well if you do it well. And so we're really excited to dig into that. Did I miss anything, Liz?
No, the acronym doesn't work for the work group to end all work groups. I tried it. We're not going to get there that way.
I was thinking that's a tagline, but not something you make into an acronym.
Yeah, I tried, but I couldn't get there. I just wanted to, the only thing I want to add is I want to just thank everybody for creating this space and time to give this kind of clear-eyed focus to students with disabilities, especially now that we're back in school. And I know that, we have a lot of educators who are in the classroom, and parents and advocates and administrators who have a lot on their plates. And to dedicate this time and this space for this group of students is just so important. And just to reiterate, as Mr. Chaudhary said last time, we have to get this right. And when we get it right for students with disabilities, we're going to get it right for all students. And part of that is going to be moving beyond kind of what we wish we could do to really concrete plans, to policies, to practices, to procedures on a timeline with accountability that's going to move the needle and ensure effective implementation of IDEA for our students. And I also wanted to just say, I know it's really challenging with this very large group of people who we've brought together very intentionally with a lot of expertise and experience. We are not going to have an intimate dinner table conversation amongst the 40 plus of us. And so if you have ideas about how to make sure that your expertise is heard, put things in writing. Respond to the questions that we're putting out, respond to the reading, so that we can all benefit from one another's expertise. And additionally, to the public who may be watching live or recorded later, we want to hear from you, because the kind of transformational change that we're talking about is going to require broad consensus from a lot of folks coming from a lot of different perspectives. So it's going to be really important that we hear from you. And so we're ready to get started. Yeah.
We just have a few housekeeping items. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you again. Dylan, if you can go back to the last slide. Thank you. Just wanted to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed via MSDE's YouTube channel. Also wanted to remind folks to make sure that you're on mute if you are joining us virtually. And also, you should have noticed that we are excited we have a sign language interpreter interpreting for our meeting today. So thankful we were able to work with our MSDE team to make that accommodation for folks. So just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. Next slide. Mr. Chaudhary pretty much went over the agenda. Again, we're going to start off with public comment. We do have some new guests joining us. Mr. Chaudhary, did you want to list them off, or I can do so? Okay. We want to welcome Senator Lewis Young. Was not available to join us in August, but has joined us today. Also, Delegate Palakovich Carr, recently appointed, and also Dr. Rebecca Cruz, recently appointed, who is an expert in over-identification. Thank you so much for joining us for the work group. We're going to do a brief recap of our first meeting, then we'll move into our guiding question for today's meeting. We'll talk about the IEP process and student performance framework. We'll have some time to discuss some reading and research, then get into developing recommendations and talk about future meetings and next steps. So with that, I will turn it over to Carmen to talk about public comment.
Great. So we do have some guests registered today. Oh, sorry. We do have a number of guests registered today to provide public comment, and I will call out names, and if you are on the Zoom call, if you could unmute, and then you will have 3 minutes to provide your public comment. We take virtual registrants or in-person registrants. Comments are limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We will time the 3 minutes, and when the time expires, we ask the speaker to finish their sentence but not make any further remarks. Comments are directed to the entire group, not an individual, and we will take your comments under advisement, but will very likely not respond. So our first guest is Marlene Finch. Marlene, are you on the web call? Okay, I don't see her on the Zoom. Miss Phillips, Lynn Phillips? Miss Marcelino? No. Okay, Miss Johnson, Barbara Johnson. She confirmed not an hour ago. And Miss Reed was coming in person, but I don't see her here in person.
I am on the Zoom call.
Oh, there you go. Well, okay. Miss Reed, welcome. Thank you. I was looking for you. So please, if you'd like, you have 3 minutes to provide your comments.
Good evening. I've taught English and PGCPS since 2001. During that time, I've earned 2 master's degrees in literacy, one in curriculum and instruction focused on teaching English to speakers of other languages, and the other as a reading specialist. As a trained reading specialist, I focus on students' reading process as much as I focus on their reading outcomes. Student struggles with the reading process is evident in classroom data, district level benchmarks, and state level assessments like the MCAT. Providing students with effective reading intervention is essential for student success. Although many software-based interventions inadequately address students' developmental needs, the learning space has become cluttered with educational software. For instance, one reading intervention program provides reading passages to each student based on that student's reading level, making it appear to be an ideal solution. In reality, differentiated texts are just one part of a comprehensive reading intervention program. A well-trained teacher would use a grade level copy of the text to model using reading strategies, an instructional level copy of the same text for guided practice, and a copy of the same text at the student's independent reading level for independent reading. A well-trained teacher would also know that building vocabulary knowledge and background knowledge and data analysis are also crucial parts of changing students' reading trajectories. Students with low reading scores and low educational outcomes need assessments that reveal their vocabulary knowledge knowledge and reading comprehension across genres, identifying students' instructional level, independent level, and frustrational level means that the SPED students who need it have teachers with specialized knowledge who know how to use assessments and time and precision and skill to meet students' instructional needs. Currently, most students, including special education students, struggle with reading strategy use because they have not received the reading instruction they need. Nevertheless, these students have progressed through school without development. A recent review of the reading data from the Reading Intervention Program our district selected for reading intervention shows that every single student in a class spent less than 10 minutes reading the differentiated text assigned based on their reading level. Most students spent 2 to 3 minutes reading the passage and answering the comprehension questions, suggesting that students found the answers on the internet. Although technology is extremely helpful, there is a need to vet and critique and limit the use of educational software for vulnerable students who need rich, explicit instruction and interactions to make the reading and learning process more clear. Thank you.
Thank you. 13 seconds to spare.
Thank you.
And Ms. Reed is our final public comment. So we will move into the next section.
Okay, so we're just going to briefly recap what we did last time. So we looked at a lot of data, and all of that is now available on the Special Education Workgroup website if people want to review it. And then we briefly touched on a second question, which was, and Mr. Choudhury's mentioned it a few times, how do we overcome persistent barriers to effective implementation? And so if you could go to the next slide, the, where we're starting from is over 20 years, you can look back at any number of other groups of committed, well-credentialed educators, parents, advocates, administrators who got together to examine specific aspects of special education and made all kinds of recommendations related to interpretations of the law, implementation, practice. Some of them were implemented, some of them were not. Some processes have been, tweaked and improved over time. But ultimately, we know from having looked at the data, which we looked at last time, that students with disabilities continue to fare poorly by virtually all measures. So what's standing in the way of the full implementation of a lot of these recommendations? Before we do that, so these are some of the studies, and you could take a look over the course of our time together over the next year. We'll pull out some of these recommendations and review them and see which ones we might want to continue to discuss and bring forward again, but with attention to those barriers. So let's go to the next slide. The next couple of slides actually show some of these, some of the recommendations categorized. So things in instruction like, systemic use with fidelity of universal design for learning, or the support for the broad and deep implementation of evidence-based practices, things we certainly will be discussing over our months together. Issues regarding teacher quality, teacher prep programs. The next slide has some regarding accountability, fiscal monitoring for evaluating resource allocation, short-term investments and supplemental interventions. So there's all kinds of things here. So the question is, what are the barriers that have prevented some of this, the full implementation of some of these recommendations? And I'm going to sort of present three that I believe are barriers, and you may have some others, and we might have a couple minutes where people could share some of the things that they're thinking about. But for me, the three big ones are the siloing of general and special education. So, and that happening, at all different levels, from the state to the LEAs to school buildings to teacher prep. Getting agreement and reform to happen across that barrier is really challenging. The second is around the need for state standards and the exercise of the state's general supervisory authority. And one nice thing in this moment is that we have to guide us some new guidance that came out of the U.S. Department of Education about 6 weeks ago. That is specifically around the state general supervision responsibilities under Parts B and C of IDEA. And the document goes into pretty great detail about what a reasonably designed general supervision system looks like. And one of the things that I'll call attention to is that a reasonably designed general supervision system should have policies, practices, and procedures that result in the effective implementation of IDEA. So that's statewide standards to address the problems, the systemic problems that we find, significant disproportionality, segregated placements, the achievement gap, and ultimately, the poor long-term outcomes for so many of our students. And this guidance also goes into pretty great detail about the responsibility of the state to correct both individual and systemic noncompliance. And so, and we're going to hear, I think, a little bit about state monitoring today, and that is going to be really helpful to think about how we can take that even further. And so that responsibility and authority and the exercise of it is so important, and one of the barriers that's prevented us from that full implementation in the past. And then the last one is low expectations, and that's the second guiding question for today, or the major guiding question for today. And low expectations, I think, really has two pieces to it. One is sort of the hearts and minds piece. It's rooted in, we live in a society where there exists ableism, where there exists unconscious bias around disability. And sometimes we wrap it up in compassion, or we wrap it up in common sense, but it affects the way what we expect from our students. And we need to address that. But the second part of it is the way that bias has become concretized within our systems, in our policies and in our practices and in our procedures, and the way that it has prevented us from recognizing the expectations in the law regarding what we actually should expect from students with disabilities, what we are required to expect of them, how we should be using the IEP process to enable students to meet grade level standards, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And so, as we talk about these barriers, I think every time we bring up a recommendation today and in the months to come, we just want to think about, have we made this recommendation before? Has it been implemented? Can we embed within the recommendation ways to dismantle barriers so that we can actually move forward? So I'm going to stop talking, and if there is, I think we have just a couple minutes. If anybody has, yeah, go ahead, Buzzy.
What about funding? Funding for students with disabilities is unconscionably low. Everybody knows that. And it can't be done with mirrors. And we can always do better with what we've got, but you cannot. We know that almost every IEP that's done is based on what the school has, not what the child needs.
So, also under IDEA, a required part of the IEP that I didn't see mentioned in any of the materials, but I think is a really critical piece is transition, right? In Maryland, required to start at age 14, nationally 16, measured by indicator 14, post-school outcomes. There's a lot of emerging research. Transition is sort of the newer piece of IDEA and IEP and so forth, but there's predictors of post-school success. So there's a lot of research out there that says, hey, if students have these things like travel training, like paid work while in school, they're far more likely to engage in paid work post-school, and so forth. And so I just want to make certain that we recognize that, some of that research might not have even occurred when some of these task forces were occurring and so forth. But there's an entire body of work and study that I think really aligns with the blueprint, that clear career college readiness, and how can we use that transition piece of the IEP to help ensure that alignment, not just in terms of the academic standards, but in all of the other pieces that the IEP is supposed to be measuring and ensuring that students are acquiring to achieve post-school career and college readiness.
So just one comment, when folks are talking, I think including me, including me, when people are speaking, if they could speak up a little bit and get closer to their microphone, the people on the Zoom are having a difficult time hearing folks.
And I think one of the other barriers, and it is not been mentioned from our first session to our second session, is one of the biggest barriers is authentic family engagement. IDEA is very clear about it. If you look at the West Ed study, just really authentic. And while we are talking about IEPs, I need to, when we talk about low expectations, we need to start with our itty bitties, our birth to 3. That is the birthplace of high expectations for families feeling empowered. It is the birthplace of self-determination, and it is the cornerstone that will change a lot of the barriers and address a lot of the barriers that we're talking about.
If I could just jump in here. I think one of the big barriers is, and I kind of gathered this from the article, but from what my experience dictates to me, is you want the best, but IDEA says appropriate, and clarifying what is appropriate. You know, I can remember when I was a special education student, Montgomery County Public Schools felt a resource room classroom at a general ed public high school was appropriate for me. And that is what they came up with. My parents, however, felt that they wanted the best for me, so they enrolled me in the Chelsea School. Now, there's a difference there. Was Montgomery County Public Schools providing an appropriate education for me? Yeah, possibly. But my parents wanted what they felt was the best. So and I know, you know, we had the presentation of Massachusetts. I believe Massachusetts has a law that supersedes a federal law requiring the best for special education students. So maybe sort of clarifying those differences. And also, just a sidebar I want to follow out, as someone who teaches and has come up in Prince George's County teaching at the public separate schools, I find the term segregated to be inappropriate. You know, just because the students in my school and the students I've taught over the years have been in a separate placement does not mean that they have been segregated. There are lots of other examples, I'm sure I can dig up, where school systems have special education students included, and because, let's say, there's a general education teacher that's listed as a co-teacher, but they have all the kids with IEPs in one classroom, you can make that argument that that is would be some sort of segregation. So that's all I have to say.
I think we have a couple of people on Zoom. Betsy Perry.
Good evening, thank you. Hi, I'm Betsy Perry. I'm a special education teacher of close to 30 years in Montgomery County Public Schools. I'm a teacher in a homeschool model program. I just have a couple of thoughts. I'll keep it brief. The last slide had an article linked about dyslexia. I am fortunate to be a Montgomery County Public School teacher. They have wonderful higher ed partnerships, and I just completed my dyslexia certificate. And one area that needs to be looked at the school level is professional development. So I'll tease out one part where the big push in reading language arts is the science of reading. So in my program, I learned a lot about the science of reading. And in school, no fault to anyone, it's starting to get momentum in MCPS, but had I not had my certificate classes, it wouldn't have made as much sense. So I think we also need to look at professional development for staff. I also have a child who graduated from MCPS who had an IEP. And I think that it was challenging for him to graduate because he has an educated parent, and I had good relationships with his high school and the stakeholders that work with him. You know, he was able to graduate. Looking at this slide, I have testified in Capitol Hill and Annapolis about how we are not fully funded. I'm in a Title I school. We're in a school with 85% Hispanic, Latina population, and students and families who speak other languages than English as their primary language. That's having a significant impact on us. Some of the issues with family engagement, our school leadership team works very hard to try to close that gap. In fact, I might need to leave a couple of minutes early because tonight is back to school night. But on that note, there's a lot of fatigue for staff because we feel like we're doing everything we can to reach out, and then we have very low participation. We're a community school. We do a lot to reach out, and we're just not seeing the parents participate at a level that would really maybe help. So we definitely want to look at that. And lastly, I want to address the elephant in the room, that there's a severe lack of teachers, and there are many positions that are open. I'm a member of CTL in Montgomery County, Councils for Teaching and Learning, and my co-partner for special ed in elementary just said she has a caseload of 32. They're down 2 special ed teachers. This is not indicative of just 1 or 2, it's across the state. So all the good work that we're gonna try to do here to support our students and our families with disabilities, you know, that has to be addressed, that there are just not enough people right now who are qualified to be able to do the work. And that's something that needs to be woven in all the discussions. Thank you for your consideration.
Thanks. And D, SAP.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry. My name is Dee Sapp. I am the Executive Director for Accessibility Bridge Corporation. I am the Chair for the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council. I'm the Vice Chair for Charles County CCAC, and I am also a member of the CTE Steering Committee for the Blueprint for Charles County Public Schools. My question for you is, well, in response to the potential barriers, I'm looking at the other part of the blueprint regarding college and career readiness, and the part about the new curriculum standards and expanded access to career and technical education opportunities. My question for you is, can anyone explain if there is a connection between transition planning and access to the program, the career and technology program for students with IEPs? And the reason why I'm asking is because we just mentioned the requirement for transition at age 14 and post-secondary outcomes for the students, but there seems to be a barrier to access to these programs for students with IEPs because I guess the requirement or the eligibility doesn't really get them to the point where they actually they meet the guidelines. So that actually goes to disproportionality based on what you have on this slide. So has anyone ever looked into that part of it, matching the transition to the career and college and career readiness that you already have in the other part of the blueprint? Thank you.
I'm happy to answer that, not from the school system blueprint perspective, but We do have a state agency transition collaborative that works cross-agency, of which CTE is a member. And we have been looking at how can we understand what's happening. So there are a couple of factors. I think that there's the capacity issue. Right. And so, my daughter applied for a CTE program. It was completely random. And so that happens. And then I know that part of the blueprint goal is to actually build out those programs so there is more capacity. So that there will be more seats. But yes, in theory, as part of that transition planning process, all of the post-school career goals. So if a student is saying, as part of their IEP meeting, I have a goal of wanting to work in automotive, then yes, trying to figure out how that can align and be part of their transition goals should be happening as we build out that capacity. I think that's part of the vision, which I think is really, really exciting to see that shift occur. So I'll let the state also answer, but we have been having discussions about that to ensure that alignment and opportunity. And yes, it should be part of their transition plan in the IEP.
I can also speak a bit to the work that our secondary transition department is doing in coordination with DOORS and in coordination with a number of other agencies. Our goal for the upcoming sort of 6 months of our scope of professional learning is first to get in on the ground floor and look at where is the disconnect between awareness of these programs, awareness of how to get students into them, how to refer families to them. Coming up, we have a professional learning series for school guidance counselors to get them a bit more involved. So thank you so much for bringing up that point, because it is very much on all of our minds and has come up in a lot of this work.
And I want to add one big shout out. The State Department of Education has created an incredible dashboard of the CTE enrollment across the local areas, and you can see students with disabilities, and you can see the progress that's being made in terms of increasing that representation to ensure that the representation is in alignment with the population. So if you haven't seen that CTE dashboard, it really is fantastic. Check it out.
There's a couple of other things to note. Is some of it is just also good old-fashioned tracking. So CTE has become also one of those things. It's made a comeback, but it's also become higher performing kids are still getting the the best end of the stick. And so that's happening. So, Blueprint envisions 45% of students getting, earning an industry recognized credential or pursuing apprenticeships. Students with special needs or disabilities are not getting apprenticeships. They might be getting some job training, et cetera. And usually when you look at those jobs, sometimes they're not as meaningful as what they are with apprenticeships. We do better indoors, a place that I have, really leaned into. But when you look at just the general work that school systems are doing, you're not seeing students with special needs getting into it. There's new inequities being created in CTE, period. Additionally, the blueprint sets a new college and career readiness standard. And so there's this notion of like whoever is not ready should not jump into pathways. That's going to create another challenge as well when you look at outcomes. We are looking at alternative measures that have very strong predictability that we know, no surprise. So that should help open the net. But there's also just good old-fashioned ableism. Employers are not necessarily showing their willingness to take a student with special needs into that apprenticeship, right? I have yet to see a registered apprenticeship where there's a student with an IEP at scale. It's like a droplet. I mean, it is literally like a droplet. So I was going to announce this through a press release this week, but I'm just going to say it now. So we just got $10 million through the Federal Disability Innovation Fund to do exactly that. If you read that application, which is already live on USED, press release doesn't matter. It was already live. You could click and go see it. It's $10 million with several of our local jurisdictions that are reflective of the state to disrupt that low expectation and get students with first it was written like, oh, we'll get them into internships. No, we're going to get them industry recognized credentials, and we're going to get them into apprenticeships. So that is one of the other things that's being introduced that's going to go live this year. Parents Place is a big partner in that grant. UMD is, Doors. It's one of those things to help unlock answers, right, and disrupt in the right way. So I'm looking forward to that as well. But we got that. That's just going to be a press release that comes out. It's already public. You can go to USED. We had one of the highest rated apps out of 100 points. We scored over 90, and it's one of those that will force general education and special education and Doors and MSDE to work together. And we have several school systems that are reflective of the state that are going to be in it with us. So that's something that's coming up as well too.
Great conversation, thank you. So we will transition to our next guiding. Talking about here is what are the existing standards and expectations under IDEA for the progress of students with disabilities that they should be able to achieve? How do we ensure that individualized education program goals are set that are appropriately ambitious? And so we're going to have some of our MSDE staff, Molly Connor, Brian Morrison, Branch Chief, and we all know Chandra Haslett, present information related to the IEP process, accountability, as well as some data. So I'll turn it over to Molly.
Hi.
Hazlett.
All right. Hi, everybody. So if we can pop over to the next slide.
Molly, I'm not sure you're
Oh,
speaking on.
can folks hear me?
That's better.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for looking out for the shorts among us. Okay, so in the next bit of slides, we're just gonna work to develop a shared understanding so that when we jump into some work later in the group, we are all working off of a shared definition. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So this is just an overview of the IEP process as it relates to an initial referral up to and including annual reevaluations. The Parents Place of Maryland actually has a wonderful one-pager that I used to give out at every IEP meeting that highlighted specific dates and deadlines within this process. So we start off with the referral. And then the assessment. If a student is found eligible, we then develop the IEP, we implement it, we progress monitor, and annually we have a review and reevaluation happens at least every 3 years. Of course, if a student is making significant progress or there are concerns, we can always come back and order more appropriate evaluations. Next slide, please. So we want to pull back a bit and just talk about the legal and regulatory requirements that guide our work. Basically, the federal guidelines and state guidelines both say that students should be educated according to grade level standards. That guides the core of the work. It is right there in black and white. We have high standards for our students with disabilities. We have the same standards for our students with disabilities. If we can pop to the next slide. So the way that that works in guidance is through a number of documents that have come out. We have reinforced the importance of holding our students with disabilities to a high standard. So a lot of times when people hear holding students with disabilities accountable to the same standard as their non-disabled peers, they think sometimes that's approached from a deficit mindset, and the thought is, okay, if my 8th grader is in a classroom and the average reading level in that classroom is 5th grade, then that's what we're trying to get our students to. Of course, that's not true. The standard for all students is the same. If I'm in the 8th grade, then the standard I'm working to is an 8th grade level standard. All right, let's pop to the next slide. So getting into instruction, and again, I know in this room we have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and experience. So what I'm going to go over is just to get us a shared baseline, but I do want to name that for a lot of you, this is probably something you already know, so bear with me. So as a state, we have defined certain expectations for what all students will know and be able to do at different stages. So we have our content standards. Our content standards define what students at each grade level should learn in reading, in math, etc. So in Maryland, these are the college and career ready standards for ELA and math, the next gen standards for science, and then the state has other standards for content areas such as health, physical education, things like that. But no matter the subject, all of our students are taught two standards. Art has standards, PE has standards, they all do. The achievement standards are the specific state-defined performance expectations that show how well students will be able to perform on that content once they are given the opportunity to learn it. Attainment of the standards is measured via MCAP and then other formative and summative assessments. The vast majority of students with disabilities, approximately 90%, are expected to achieve the same standards as all other students, of course, given specially designed instruction to learn the content and provided with appropriate accommodations to the assessment to give them the opportunity to show what they know. Accommodations are not meant to water down a test or water down the standard. They are meant to give students the conditions they need to show exactly what they can do. A small percentage of students with disabilities, approximately 10% of students with disabilities, which equates to 1% of students overall, with the most significant cognitive disabilities are assessed according to the alternate academic achievement standards, and they take an assessment, most commonly the dynamic learning maps essential elements. However, these standards are still derived from the same standards as their non-disabled peers. They are reduced in depth, breadth, and complexity, but they are still grade level standards. That is something that gets lost in conversation a lot, and that's just something I want to highlight. Does anyone have any questions or want to chime in? Okay. All right, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we understand.
I'm sorry, I did have a question. I was wondering, my name's David Stone, I'm with Kennedy Krieger Schools. I was wondering if we could return to your process slide for a moment. I guess it's slide 10 or so, maybe around there.
Very first one?
This one?
That one. So as I read through this, I see that I'm just wondering where you would put placement, because I think that's an important piece, let's say between 4 and 5, that that's important for us to talk about and see as a separate piece of this process, of the overview.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, yeah, explicitly. And then I'm moving on with that, just thinking about FAPE. I think one thing the state can do is do a better job of defining what FAPE is. I mean, we have curriculum outcomes, but we don't. If you go to 2 different special ed schools, or classrooms rather, you'll see potentially very different views of what is considered free and appropriate, and the quality of the service that is delivered based on that definition.
Yeah.
So I hope that's one thing that we can discuss as we move forward. A more clearly defined view of what FAPE is and the services that kids are supposed to get and the level at which they're being implemented.
I'm happy to address the first question, and then I think FAPE is definitely on everybody's mind as we move through the work. So placement is discussed annually at every meeting. What I always say is that an IEP is not a place. Special ed is not a place. What it is specially designed instruction, accommodations, modifications, and related services that help the student learn in their most appropriate setting. And no student's most appropriate setting everything looks the same, except for the fact that they need to be provided the opportunity to engage with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent possible. So there's no separate placement meeting because it is part of the annual discussion. And for our kiddos with more restrictive environments, it's really important that we every single year take a look at what supports are in this more restrictive environment that are not available in the general education classroom, and that we look at that very critically so that we're not in the position where Jimmy is placed in a self-contained reading classroom in kindergarten and just never leaves because we don't take a critical look at that decision. So it's every single year. All right, if we can, oh, sure. Absolutely.
Ms. Rose, did you have a question?
I just wanted to make a statement. I'm Imani Rose. I'm the Executive Director of Joshua's Place Early Learning and Enrichment Center, and also the co-chair of the Baltimore City Early Childhood Advisory Council, and on the state board of directors for the Maryland State Child Care Association. And a lot of our conversation in general on a regular basis lends itself to K-12. And when we look at the blueprint and the pre-K 3 and 4, and even before that, I think we really need to also consider the very much needed look at special education students even before they hit the K-12 system.
Sure.
And how this process works. We do have infants and toddlers, and Maryland is the one state that has the extended IFSP, but we need to really look at the resources and the same issues and concerns that people have with K-12, even at that level. So as we do these discussions, I just wanted to chime in and say, we really need to think about even at an earlier stage, because again, if we start early enough and do what we need to do, some of these students, many of these students might not even need as much support in special education in the K-12 system if we start a little bit better and doing what we need to do at the early learning stages. So I just wanted to put that in the mix of all of the context of conversation.
Well, thank you for putting that in the mix. And I do want to name that our division, DISES, the Division of Early Intervention and Special Education Services, we do have a section specifically looking at early childhood special education. I personally come from an early childhood special education background, so that is a cause that is very near and dear to my heart. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation. All right, if we can go to creating standards-aligned IEPs. So we wanted to flag this because while everyone in this room is a special education expert, not everyone has actually written an IEP. So I wanted to give you guys sort of a quick elevator pitch of how we write an IEP. And then after this, we can all go open up a special education school together, and it'll be fantastic. Oh yeah, we need teachers. So for all students, regardless of what assessment is used to measure their achievement, the purpose of special education is to allow them to access and progress in the general education curriculum. So we need to meet students where they are instructionally. We don't want them to stay there. So for a 7th grader reading on the 2nd grade level, we don't teach 2nd grade content. The IEP describes how we will enable that student to master 7th grade content while also working to improve skills in deficit areas. So this process begins with the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, usually called a PLAF, which I just saw about 3 of you mouth, so we all know what a PLAF is. So we describe the student's performance in reference to grade level expectation. We highlight critical skills that they have mastered and then what areas still need to be developed. And we explain the impact of their disability on their learning. For functional areas, I just want to name, like feeding, transition, items like that. While there might not be a grade level standard, there are, age level expectations. So that's what we describe their performance in regards to. So the PLAF is really the foundation of the IEP. We start with it first because it guides everything else. So from there, we look at what accommodations, modifications, and supplementary aids and services does the kiddo need to remove barriers to learning and demonstrating those skills? We also look at, do we need to adapt the environment? Are there environmental changes we need to consider? Are there instructional strategies that can support more active engagement? So we look at the accommodations, supplementary aids and services, and we look at the goals and the objectives. We focus specially designed instruction on critical skills to accelerate progress and narrow the gap. We align with grade level standards and student strengths and needs. Again, it is essential if a child is showing a deficit in a performance area that they have a grade level goal. So if I am in 9th grade and I'm reading at a 4th grade level, that means I get a 9th grade level goal. I get some other goals too, and we'll get into that in a second, but standards guide the IEP. Performance and then standards. And then finally, the last thing that we look at, we've looked at, here's how my kiddo is doing, here's what they need, here's the learning goal. So now, what delivery of special education do they need, and what related services do they need? And this is specific to the student. No student's IEP looks the same, no student's service delivery model looks the same. So it does include specialized instruction, but it might also include related services and things of that nature. Does anybody have any questions about our elevator lesson on drafting an IEP? Okay. I want to also speak a bit, if we can pop to the next slide. I want to speak a bit to a sort of fail-safe we have in place in Maryland Online that helps us ensure our IEPs are aligned to grade level standards. So Maryland Online is the online system that the vast majority of our LEAs use to house and create IEPs. So if a student's disability impacts an academic area, then at least one academic goal aligned with a grade level standard must be developed. Additional goals may be developed. So if I have a 7th grader who cannot decode, of course he needs a decoding goal. Of course he needs explicit specially designed instruction to help him decode. But he also, needs to learn to read and critically analyze text aligned to 7th grade standards. For students performing in the alternate assessment, their goals are still aligned to grade level standards with performance targets that are influenced by what's called the essential elements. In Maryland Online, when you are creating a goal for a kiddo, it will not let you close out if you have not selected a grade level standard aligned to the goal level deficits. Our systems who don't use Maryland Online, they are still held to this expectation that just fail-safe isn't there. I want to name that because when you print out the IEP, what's interesting is, say I'm a special education case manager, I have drafted a beautiful goal, it is aligned to a grade level standard, I've clicked the standard it's aligned to, but when you print it out, the standard doesn't actually print out with it. It's more of a tool to just ensure that we are doing what we're supposed to do. It doesn't necessarily evaluate like, oh, I see that this goal is aligned to analyzing text, but the standard you picked is more aligned to pulling out themes or comparing and contrasting. It doesn't get to that level, but it does hold us accountable for grade level standards. Okay, I will let Brian take it over unless anyone has any questions. Okay, thank you so much. Oh.
Sorry, I just have a question about many of the kids that I work with are in that 10% who are getting the alternate assessment. I'm really struggling to come up with a grade level goal that you might have for that 10%. I'm trying to figure out what that would look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure we have like specific guidance. I could also speak to my time as a case manager. Sure. So for a lot of our kiddos with more significant cognitive disability, for me, a lot of the times it really lived in the sort of methodology and the accommodations embedded in the goal. So for example, if we are doing a deep dive on a text, if I'm working with a student who is nonverbal, then expecting them to, make an oral argument would be wildly inappropriate. So what I would do a lot of times is I would pre-select certain pieces of text or certain visuals and really live in the spirit of the standard. But I think we can definitely look into some resources and get back to you if that's okay. All right, thank you.
Those things are what we call conditions. Yes. So you might say, and we have a framework for writing goals, and we might say, given a field of 3, the student will use eye gaze to, something, and put the grade level standard in something like that.
I guess I'm still, and I don't want to take up a lot of time with this, but I'm seeing this as something that may impact parent engagement too, because if I have a parent who comes to me and says, my 14-year-old who is functioning at a 3-year-old level is supposed to have grade level goals. So for instance, using eye gaze to pick something from a field of 3 is not a grade level goal for a 9th grader.
But
So
you use the grade level text, or the grade level standard to do it. So it does become that. It's
guess
the
I'm still
condition under
struggling
which you're asking them to do that grade level text.
Sorry, if I could jump in here, the teacher would probably be using an adaptive grade level text that is adapted more to the student's realistic functioning level expectation.
Definitely can be done. I have a great PD that I can give you that I just did. Okay. I'm serious.
Great, okay, thanks.
It can be done.
Great. Next slide, please. All right, so I've been asked to speak on our, who am I? My name is Dr. Brian Morrison. I'm the branch chief for policy and accountability. I oversee 2 sections in the Division of Early Intervention Special Education Services. One is the research and data section, which is responsible for data collection, analysis, and reporting, both federally and to the state. I also oversee the accountability and monitoring section, responsible for both comprehensive and targeted monitoring to local education agencies and local infants and toddlers programs, and public agencies throughout the state, anybody who touches students with disabilities. We call our monitoring process the accountability to improve performance, and I think why it's important for me to talk to you guys is that probably most folks think that what we do is just look at records, and that is what we do, but it's a small piece of what we do. We do require LEAs and LITPs to do a self-assessment to talk about their infrastructure, collaboration with agencies, and performance and compliance on IDEA requirements. They have to then present their self-assessment to us. We invite our both programmatic and policy staff, monitoring staff, to be a part of that so that programmatic staff learn about areas of each individual LEA and LITP. We do desk audits. We do up to 80 desk audits, 80 students per LEA or LITP. There are 34 items for IFSP and 89 items for IEP that we look at for each individual student. We do record reviews, so we look at service delivery. So we'll take a month in time and look at whether or not services as dictated on the IEP are actually provided over that particular month. So we do 25 of those. We look at the alternate education framework decision-making. We do up to 80 records to make sure that the decision-making that teams use is appropriate and places students who should be in the alternate framework and not students who shouldn't be in the alternate framework. We do audits of restraint and seclusion documents to ensure that the documentation meets the letter of the law and that students aren't restrained or secluded in cases in which violates that law. We review every LEA and LITP's policies and procedures to make sure they're consistent with IDEA and COMAR. And then we do case studies. Case studies is relatively new. We started that about 4 years ago. This is time intensive. We observe a classroom or home visit, depending on where the child is placed. We review IFSP, IEP records for the previous 3 years to look at IEP team decision-making to make sure that if a student is not making appropriate progress, the IEP team or IFSP team has modified the IEP in such a way to then narrow the gap. And then we do interviews with stakeholders, including local leadership, parents, students if they're transition age, as part of that case study so that we can learn about the IEP process for each individual student. But I will say that the largest number of case studies we do based on jurisdiction size is 8 because they're so time intensive. Next slide, please. When we are done with those 6 components, we write a comprehensive monitoring report, and it serves as our identification of non-compliance, and it starts the 1-year timeline for correction as required by OSEP Memo 0902. When a jurisdiction is in non-compliance, they must correct at both the individual student level as well as a subsequent system-level data analysis. So they have to achieve, if they violate compliance in one area, we will look at a subsequent data analysis and ensure that they meet 100% compliance or they have not fully corrected non-compliance. Next slide. Before I talk about this, do you have any questions about our comprehensive monitoring system? I don't think she is.
Go ahead, Buzzy. I don't think you're on, Buzzy.
Hit this thing.
I don't think you're on. You're good.
It's very short. Could you send us a link to the latest monitoring instrument that's used, please?
I can provide our documents, certainly.
Pardon?
Yes, I can provide all of our documents. We're actually going to post them online. Part of what OSEP's new guidance suggests is that our monitoring documents be made available to the public. We have never posted them online, but we don't see any reason not to. So,
Thank you.
you're very welcome. Okay.
All right, so I think I am up next.
Okay, so I want to set the stage for Chandra's data. I know that Molly talked about this a little bit, and what research shows is that 90% of students with disabilities can learn on grade level and achieve proficiency on grade level standards. It also shows that 90% of students with disabilities are capable of leaving high school, college, and career ready if supported appropriately along the way. And that only 10% of students with disabilities may benefit from the alternate standards and assessments. Now, all those things in mind, let's see where our data shows about proficiency. I'm passing it over to Chandra Hazlitt. She's an assistant state superintendent.
Hazlitt.
Hazlitt.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chandra Hazlitt. Assistant State Superintendent of Assessment, Accountability, and Performance Reporting. I'm very happy to be here again. I take notes during these meetings, just so you guys know, and when there's anything related to data, I'm trying to make sure that we supply that data moving forward. So we want to make sure that you have all the data you need. So this section is just level setting a little bit. So I wanted to just provide context in regards to where our students with disabilities are. So slide 20. I want to make sure we're on the right side. So this is outcome data specifically for students with disabilities in comparison to students without disabilities. This includes the most recently released 2023 data. It shows trend over time. So on the left-hand side, you see mathematics 3 through 8. And you can generally see that our students with disabilities were pretty consistent at 7.2% at the last release. And that gap with the students without disabilities is about 20%. Over to the right side is English Language Arts 3 through 8. There has been an increase for students with disabilities, 11.9%, and there still is the gap of 39.5 in comparison to their students without disabilities. Next slide, please. So looking specifically at Algebra 1 on the left and English 10 on the right, so you see that for Maryland students, they have returned to the pre-pandemic performance in English 10, and smaller gains are seen in the mathematics. So in particular, over to the right with English 10, 14.7%. That is definitely a return to pre-pandemic levels. Noteworthy are still the gaps with the students without disabilities. All right, so as noted previously, some of our students with disabilities take the alternate assessment. Although this is actually 2022 data, we are releasing the 2023 data next week at the state board meeting. But you can see the blue lines are the 2019 data, and the lighter gray is the 2022 results. And you can see that we are still working our way back from that pandemic in both math and reading. Next slide. So there is national data that we can look at, so we can compare our students with disabilities with how the nation is doing. On the left is, actually both of these is math. On the left is grade 4, grade 8 is on the right. And you can see that the math proficiency rates for Maryland students with disabilities on this NAEP assessment were consistent when looking at 2019 to 2022, and they were very similar to what we've seen with the national rates. Next slide. Looking at reading, on the left is grade 4, on the right is grade 8. So the reading proficiency rates for students with disabilities in Maryland were consistent from 19 to 22, and they were a bit higher than the national rates. However, I just want to make note that that is not statistically significant. You can see that in the footnote in the bottom. Next slide. So looking at graduation, which is the end goal for our K through 12 students for the education, the four-year cohort graduation rate for students with disabilities has consistently been less than 70%, and substantially lower than their peers without disabilities. But I do want to just note that over the 5 years that you see here, the most recently available data is the highest that it's been in 5 years. So at 69.3%, if I can read the screen correctly. All right, so that is a quick tour of data. I know at our last meeting I had a lot of additional data that you can access on the publicly available, but I just wanted to level set as we move into the next sections of the presentation, and I will pause there for questions and turn it back over. All right, they get to the fun stuff now.
Okay, so I think we're going to look now at this piece of reading that we sent everybody by Rachel Kahneman and Martha Thurlow from the National Center on Educational Outcomes. Students with disabilities in educational policy, practice, and professional judgment, what should we expect? So hopefully people got a chance to look at that look at that reading. And see how it sort of provides this foundation for what we're talking about today. You can go to the next slide. So the first piece, I'm just going to call out a couple points that I want to pull out from the reading, and if folks have other things they'd like to chime in about, please do. But the first one is really about the impact of low expectations on student achievement. What we know is that the low expectations do real damage to students, and that there's a large body of research that shows that when what we expect a student to learn prior to teaching the student affects what they actually do learn. And it's the reason why this understanding of content standards and achievement standards is really important, and why understanding the distinction between those two things is really important. And I just want to stop for 1 second to talk about. There's been a bunch of comments made about segregated placements, about FAPE, and I just want to call out the idea that in our state, 3% of students who take the alternate assessment are included in general education classrooms 80% or more of the time. 3%. So those students are being segregated. They are not getting access to the general education curriculum or to their non-disabled peers. And that is the point, the foundational principle of IDEA. So I use the word segregation because that's what we do to students. Only 20% of students with intellectual disabilities across the board, even students who are diploma, are in general education classrooms 80% or more of the time. they are being segregated. So we have to confront that, especially in a state that has, for the last almost 40 years, been the 4th ranking state for having students in entirely separate schools. 6% of our students who have IEPs are being educated in entirely separate schools where they have no access to non-disabled peers at all. So that is part of why we're here. It is not resulting in better outcomes for kids. So we have to confront that reality.
And I might add that the post-school world is all about integration, inclusion, individualized service plans, and so forth. There's been a significant shift in the post-school services through the home and community-based waivers as a result of the Olmstead lawsuit. So we are preparing students for their post-school outcomes because they are going to be having meaningful days working alongside their peers in communities, hopefully living and thriving.
Absolutely. And meanwhile, we are also removing the benefit to non-disabled kids of being in community with their neighbors and friends and siblings and cousins who have disabilities by segregating those students. So I'll just say that there. And we need to move to an idea where, as we're talking about the IEP, we are thinking about the portability of services rather than, I think we hide often behind a continuum of placements rather than thinking about a continuum of services and where services can be delivered for kids. So that aside, in addition, when we're talking about low expectations, I just want to sort of, in the spirit of when we know better, we do better, think about the language that we use when we talk about students with disabilities, because the language we use matters. So they are students with disabilities. That's who they are. All right, so the impact that it has on individual students.
Excuse me, I have a question. Again, David Stone. You made a few comments about so-called segregated settings that I just had some questions about. As someone who works in a so-called segregated setting, I'm wondering where you get the notion that grade level instruction is not being addressed at these programs. I can assure you that in my program, they certainly are. And as you mentioned, there's a continuum of placements in this state, and the federal government fully recognizes all the placements that we have in the state of Maryland. And it's always been the policy of the state to have the full continuum of services and to make sure that students are moving between those services as necessary. But again, to say that there's some sort of instructional deficit that occurs at those schools, I think is unfair. And I think that going into these discussions with any preconceived notions about certain placements is probably not in the spirit of what we're trying to do here.
Thanks for that, David. I'm not pointing the finger at any particular program or any particular school. It's just the reality of our data. I mean, the reality of our data is 6% of kids with IEPs in the state of Maryland are being educated without any access to non-disabled peers, and that is not the case across the country. It just isn't. So, and if it was resulting in great outcomes, that would be one thing. But the reality is that only 20% of kids, of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities are employed. So that's something we need to confront.
I just hope that in this discussion, we actually have reference models where this is successfully being implemented, instead of just making statements about being in this placement or that placement. Show me a model where that 1% is in a general education classroom and it's being successfully implemented so we can all move forward. That's all.
Sure, go ahead.
And are we looking separately at children, and I know this is hard because I've looked at a lot of IEPs that have different disabilities on them, and obviously that's not what's driving services, but is there any way to separate out the data based on children with emotional disabilities versus cognitive disabilities? Because I know that clearly brings up additional different resources, I should say, that are required in the school, and, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about that, Molly? I mean, there's 13 categories, right? And yeah, so yes, you can look at the data based on the disability category. But one of the things actually, if we go to the next slide, actually, one of the things that this report talks about is that the criteria for determining disability status is highly subjective, and that it varies a lot from state to state. And even within the state, when we have a set of criteria, it's implemented differently, LEA to LEA and school to school. And we know we could know that just on the face of it. If we have some LEAs where 8.2% of students have considered students with disabilities, and others where 16.7%, I mean, that's not happenstance, right? That's different application of the criteria, place to place. And so it's just important that we not make assumptions about students and what they are capable of achieving based on their disability status or the specific disability that we've identified. And then this last slide just again points out this same issue of content standards and achievement standards, and that the same content and achievement standards as non-disabled students should be the same for about 90% of students who have disabilities, and that fewer than 1% of all students, or 10% of students with disabilities, are being assessed based on alternate achievement standards. All right. Any additional thoughts on that? Oh, go ahead.
All right, can you hear me? Should I use my teacher voice? I'm Jennifer Dorsey from A World of Friends School in Baltimore City. I have 50 students who are all in the pre-K expansion grant. I have 3 classrooms. Currently, we have 6 children already with IEPs or IFSPs that we carry out every day, and we have every bit of 25 or more students who we are getting through the process at this point. So we have lots of students. We don't have all the resources that some of your big school systems. I'm sitting here, looking at these numbers, and they're incredible. But just in my little part of the world, every day with my boots on the ground, we are servicing all of these students. And I know Imani Rojan, this was one of my colleagues, we need to not forget about the pre-K world, especially when we are hoping that so many other programs will qualify to have the pre-K expansion grant and give that parent and family that opportunity to stay in their own community with their typically developing peer as well as their special needs child, and they can work alongside, all of our students it's all inclusion. There's no, separation of any of these students, and I can tell you it's not easy. It's not easy, but we make it work. My little staff and I make it work, and we don't get a whole lot of support from Baltimore City Public Schools. I have to do a lot of yelling sometimes, and not all of our students come from Baltimore City. Some of them are Baltimore County, so we have to juggle both of those school systems as well. But I'm not seeing a whole lot of data with pre-K expansion grant students or pre-K students for that matter at all. And I know that that's a whole different ball of wax, and how we're going to collect that data and get those wonderful numbers for all these people that love numbers, because that's not me. But we need to. We're pushing pre-K expansion, so we need to kind of, at some point have that conversation and how those programs are going to be supported. Yes, professional development, I heard somebody else say, that's across the board for everybody. But many of these folks don't have the resources in their own private buildings. I'm very lucky to have a lot of resources, but not everybody does. So how are we going to address those families who choose to keep their children in their own communities?
Thank you.
Can I add, along with what she was just saying, there may be community placements for children with special needs in the early learning setting that may not do pre-K expansion, but it doesn't mean those students still don't need certain types of services. So it is a big gap in the way that they get their services and how often. And I know we have infants and toddlers, but again, just like the school systems are short with teachers, so are they with therapists and teachers and those things. So we really do need to look at and consider what it will take to make sure that all students. Sorry, I have a little one right here with me. But that all students can get what they need to best meet all their needs, no matter whether they're pre-K expansion or just in a community childcare setting.
Thanks, Imani. Okay, are we ready? We should move on to recommendations, yes? Okay, great.
Okay, so we've had a lot of great conversation, a lot of good information, a lot of different perspectives were shared, and that's what we want. It's okay to disagree, to agree. This is the function of the work group. So we're doing a great job here engaging in conversation, and we're going to continue that as we close out the rest of our meeting. We're going to focus on developing recommendations. This is our charge as a work group, is as we engage, really narrowing down, so how do we get to action, right? How do we use our collective IQ to really identify recommendations that we believe can put into practice? Liz talked about some of the conversations and recommendations from the past, but now we want to make sure we move to implementation. So we're going to have a chance to participate in a specific activity where we're going to reflect on the potential barriers and then also make some recommendations. So if you go to the next slide. What we want to focus on is how can the IEP process be improved to ensure that students are enabled to narrow the achievement gap and achieve grade level standards. We want to focus on including accurate and detailed present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, appropriate accommodations and modifications, grade level aligned goals, and reasonably calculated services. Some of the barriers that we've heard over time and even have come up recently are low expectations for student achievement, siloing of general and special education teachers, inconsistency in processes, procedures, and practices that result in an ineffective implementation. Those are just some of the barriers, not all of them, that we've heard. So we want to begin to consider what supports are necessary and the recommendations we can make for the IEP team, the school, the public agency, and the state levels. Collectively, it's not one person's role or responsibility. Our collective efforts is how we really can move the needle for students with disabilities. So that's what we're going to focus on. I'm going to be giving some directions, but just want to foreshadow for those of you on the live stream, our next activity is going to provide an opportunity for members, all of us. Buzzy, you had a question?
Well, I appreciate this, but I must say, as first time we mentioned recommendations, historically, we have recommendations and recommendations that are generalities and don't get acted upon. Mm-hmm. We all know that. It seems like we're headed down that road today in terms of going around the room. I have, for better or worse, submitted specific, actionable recommendations at a level of specificity that arises from much experience and interaction with MSDE in the past. So how do we get to that? I've distributed it, I've asked it to be discussed, and I would like to have those recommendations discussed.
So I believe you'll actually get an opportunity to do that if you just let me continue, Buzzy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. We believe that some of the recommendations that you've posed align to the activity we're going to get to, and we'll have a chance to discuss. So, but to your point, we want to get to be very specific and not go around and around. That's the whole point of this work group. So you've elevated a really good, important point. So I think we'll get to that. But I just wanted to make sure the members that are live streaming and those that are in the audience know that we are going to be doing some reflection and using what's called a Padlet, which is it's like an online bulletin board to capture very specific and concrete recommendations. And we're going to use a framework that you see on the screen here to help us get narrow, as Buzzy just alluded to, in terms of very specific recommendations. As you think about making recommendations, we want you to think about the area of elevating expectations for students with disabilities. And we have one example here that we generated. How do we provide local staff with training to self-reflect on inherent bias and internalize messages about the ability of students with disabilities to achieve at grade level? Another category is collecting and analyzing student data, developing staff capacity and processes for writing IEPs with high expectations, rethinking systems of accountability and monitoring, breaking down silos between general and special education, and then there may be other areas that may not fit into those categories. But we want to try and get narrow and very specific. You can go to the next slide, Dylan.
Dr. Levy, did you have something to say? You had your hand up.
Yeah, I did, but I think I'll wait until we do the next activity. It may fit better there.
Okay, good. So what we want everyone to do right now is to take some time to reflect independently. And then you'll have a chance to use the Padlet to post your recommendations under the topic. I'll show you what the Padlet is going to look like. But just let me get through the directions. So for those of you that are here in the room, there are Post-it notes around the room where you can write down some of your reflections and thinking around the categories that we discussed. They're on your tables in front of you. And for those of you that are in the virtual space, you have some options as well. You can click on the Padlet link that was dropped in the chat, or you can post your comment in the chat box, and one of our staff members here will post it on screen. But we've created a way where everybody can see the recommendation so we can have a discussion. The sticky notes that, for those of you here in person, you can share it with one of our staff members here, Carmen, Brian, or Molly, and we'll make sure we can type it on the Padlet, or if you feel you can type it on the Padlet on your own, if you have a computer, it's really up to you. But again, we want to make sure that we can capture everybody's comments, so you'll have some time to do individual reflection. And then if you go to the next slide, Dylan, we can show folks what the Padlet looks like. So this is the online bulletin board. It has all the categories that we just mentioned. We'll make sure that this is posted so folks can see. But the question we're focusing on is, again, how can the IEP process be improved to ensure that students are enabled to narrow the achievement gap and achieve grade level standards? So we want everyone to take some time to think about that question and think about those ideas along the categories that we described. If your question recommendation doesn't fit into that category, you can put it in the other category. And if you have other thoughts and ideas that you just want to share, we want to capture those as well. So all ideas are open on the table. You're not confined or constrained to just what we see here. Okay? Okay. So let's take about 5 minutes or so for some reflection time, and then we'll begin to post the comments and engage in an open discussion.
And those of you on the Zoom should be able to see the Padlet recommendations show up in real time.
Okay, can I try to use the Padlet now? Yes. I'm going to text the link to you. Okay, text the link to me. Text me the link.
It's in the chat for the Zoom.
That's why I was trying to get to the chat. I was trying to get to the chat to the Zoom.
that piece of the instruction.
It's okay.
Yeah, so those of you on a computer can just go right to the link.
I was trying to get to the chat to the Zoom, but I couldn't get there
Or
without
write
going
it down
into
on a
it.
yellow piece of paper and we'll type it for you. Whichever works best for you.
Okay. Okay, Molly texted. Did you?
They're not out.
Or you can email it to me. Just forward me the email.
That was not right. Okay. Only half of it. Wish I could delete it. You got it?
If anyone needs the link emailed to have it clickable, just let me know. Yep, I'm coming around to you.
Yes, you sent it?
We're going to take about 2 more minutes.
You want me to give these to Brian to type it? Yeah.
So we're going to just look at a couple of the recommendations in each section. And folks can, you know, we're not going to have time to go through every one, but I think it's just a really good exercise. This has been it's really valuable information. So for instance, under elevating expectations for students with disabilities, there's a component recommending that we start with parental engagement that lifts parental expectations for each child with a disability. Further down, there's one that starts with COMAR and MSDE guidance should be revised to explicitly provide students with significant cognitive disabilities are legally entitled to IEP goals services that enable them to have access to grade level content standards and to meet alternate grade level standards. Goals should be based on evidence-based practices, related services, and least restrictive environment principles that maximize their potential. If we go over to collecting and analyzing student data, there are recommendations that the same data that is tracked for non-IEP students should be tracked for IEP students, not students with disabilities. There are students who identify as having a disability but don't need an IEP. The numbers trend too high when we don't segregate that data. Further down, it says the use of common software that would capture data. This will translate across counties. Everyone should be on the same page when it comes to gathering and analyzing student data. If we go over to building staff capacity and process for writing IEPs with high expectations, the first one is build in time to partner with families to gather authentic input in the development of their child's IEP. And then further down, be consistent with professional development and expectations. Often at district meetings, an expectation is shared. Then later, another district level stakeholder states a different expectation. When we go over to rethinking systems of accountability and monitoring, the AIB, in consultation with MSDE, should set outcome measure targets for short and long-term growth in the achievement of students with disabilities. Further down, develop intentional schedules that allow for general and special education teachers to have joint planning time. Over in breaking down silos, we have make it a requirement for general education teachers all to have ongoing training on how to be more intentional about helping IEP students progress towards IEP goals. Many teachers state they don't know how to read an IEP or how to implement it, even in an inclusion classroom. It's also been stated that while this type of training is offered, it is not required. Again, there's a comment about providing time for general and special education teachers to plan together and collaborate. Also, professional development on effective co-teaching. Then when we go to the other category, we have a number of good ideas. Again, some on professional development. One that says develop MTSS, multi-tiered system of support, and RTI standards and implementation plans. That a liaison between the school system and the private providers and would create a smooth referral process. And just the last one I'll read, an inclusive practices guide for students with significant cognitive disabilities.
Buzzy, did you want to add anything? Did you get to make comments? But this might be a good time for you to share.
Is it on? Yes. Okay. Two things. One, I think we need a definition of what a recommendation is that we're eventually going to submit. Let me just take two examples from what came up. List 12 good things for parent engagement. It seems to me that recommendation's been made, all back in every report. It seems to me our job is to develop a list of those 12 things and present those. That's a specific recommendation with a timeline, tasks and timelines. Another one is MTSS, RTI. Everybody's for that, hallelujah. We want standards and at least an implementation, structure and anatomy for what MTSS RTI is. So unless we do that, we're just doing the same business that 26 other groups did. One other general comment, if I may. The English language learners work group did a fantastic job, and I commend Mr. Chaudhry for that and MSDE. They had experts at meetings who presented specifics. We have had no expert here today for this extremely important. I mean, you can consider me an expert, maybe yes, maybe no, I offered. So it seems to me that we're missing the boat. I mean, everybody's got something to contribute, but there's an expertise that must be involved. You had that in the English language. You had a very impressive array of people, and you came out with fairly specific recommendations. Aren't we going to do that?
So I can answer, and Liz, if you want to add anything, but yes to everything that you've said. So, Buzzy, the first thing is part of what we will be doing today is from everything that everyone's listed today, take this information, compile it, and bring it back to the work group and try to massage it into exactly what you're talking about, something that is an actionable language, and this is how the EL work group did it as well, into a actionable recommendation that we would socialize here and wordsmith it and put timelines, dates, and things like that. So that is the goal. And then the other piece is we actually have put together a list of experts based on the different topics. And then we were actually trying to get Dr. Thurlow to this meeting. Unfortunately, she wasn't available. But that is the expectation, that in all of these meetings, there would be an expert. We would like to have a student panel. That would be great to incorporate. We would like to have a parent panel. So that is the goal as well, is to have experts. And we actually have a list of experts that we've already started reaching out to make sure that as we look at and talk about different topics, we can do that. And then some of you on the work group may have expertise in a certain area that aligns with what we've been talking about, and we will incorporate that as well. Anything else?
Just one more, thank you. Will my recommendations be acted upon and discussed?
So I added at least 2 of the recommendations that you provided into this document that we have now.
Well, I don't know which 2 they are. I would like to discuss them.
But we,
and
yes.
have each of them considered.
Well, we do have to consider everything, and I think right now would be an appropriate time for you to bring one of them forward, and let's talk about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I don't know which 2 you picked up.
Well, it doesn't matter. I mean, I just chose a couple to put
Well, if
in.
you go to page 4 of my document that was written to assist in this process. And just for those of you who don't know, I have been involved in this issue at the city, at the state, and at the national level. In the December 15th EOE document that's referred to, I was instrumental in the development of that. Recommendation, COMAR and MSDE guidance should be revised to explicitly provide students without significant cognitive disabilities are legally entitled to IEP goals and services that enable them to meet grade level standards. When these students are behind age level standards, they should receive IEP goals and services that enable them to narrow the gap between the standards and their performance levels. That language, which is what I think we agreed upon, is not in board policy. It's not in any instrument. It's not reflected in the compliance documents, Brian's heard this song before. So, we should do that. And then I'll read B. Students with significant cognitive disabilities are legally entitled to IEP goals and services that enable them to have access to grade level content standards, including the general education curricula, and to meet alternate grade level standards. The goals should be based on evidence-based best instructional practices, related services, and LRE principles that maximize their potential. Then I say, and this goes to how MSDE is going to do staff work. MSDE should review the recommendations, consider revisions, and report back to the work group within 45 days. It seems to me that's a way to proceed. I mean, you can change it to 30 days or 60 days or what, but unless that process is followed, we're just going to be talking to each other. The second recommendation is MSD should include in its compliance protocols. Here again, I'm very specific. Do goals narrow or close the gap between present levels of achievement and grade level standards? If they do not, is there a compelling justification for why they don't? Based upon research and professional judgment, are services reasonably calculated to enable the goals to be achieved? Those questions are not, as best I know, unless there's a new instrument. That's why I asked to see. But from the instruments I've seen, these questions are not asked. Pre-referral or MTSS RTI, MSD should develop MTSS RTI standards, menus of best practices, including an operational manual, uniform data collection, monitoring, and evaluation that will prevent inappropriate referrals to special education. And then I list AIB and MSDE actions. The recommendation should be set forth in the blueprint comprehensive implementation plan. So thank you for the opportunity to share those.
Thank you, Buzzy. Anyone else want to expand on any of the comments or
Oh, that was yours.
that they put on the Padlet?
Betsy Perry on the Zoom call has her hand up and has made a comment in the chat.
Hi, just quickly, and then I have to go to back to school night. I just want to highlight all the experts that are on the panel now and on Zoom, i.e. parents and teachers, principals, and those who are closest to the work doing this work every single day. Please make sure, and thank you, Dr. Collins, for highlighting parent and students on the panel, because we need to have parent and student voice. And again, it's great to have experts in the field, but those of us who are living and doing this work every single day need to be included in that. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Joshua, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I noticed the collecting and analyzing student data is thin on comments. And I think that's indicative of what seems to get lost. Like, we've all heard the horror stories before about parents showing up to an IEP meeting and asking to see the data, and, well, there is no data. And there needs to be a universal method of collecting data. Student goal matrix page. It's right there in Maryland Online IEP. I use it for my data. You guys give it to me. Thank you very much. It's great. Or software, maybe some change that would allow teachers or case managers to enter the data. The other thing, I didn't put this in here too, is giving paraprofessionals access to Maryland Online to assist the special education teacher in implementing or putting online this data and uploading, giving them their own access to upload all the bajillion documents that we have to upload. Now, I understand that there is a need for these documents to be uploaded for accountability, but remember, that takes time. Scanning a document and then going and uploading it, that takes time. That eats up a chunk of my planning time, which could be used adapting, as Mr. Hedelman was saying. Sorry, it's not doctor, is it, Mr.?
I've been called worse. Anything you want to call.
Okay,
Be my guest.
but
Buzzy.
But Buzzy, as Buzzy says, adapting a piece of grade level curriculum, just as an example, with language, we can say we want the bread to be sliced great with the best butter on it. Who here remembers Alt MSA? Remember Alt MSA? Who here is responsible for grade level adapted play? Well, I was charged with grade level adapted play. Guess what? There was no grade level adapted play. I had to adapt the play myself. Now, just to keep in mind, when we, as we talk about grade level and content, making sure that there are things in place for special education teachers to adapt or have access to this content.
Can I just say one thing about the paraprofessionals? We don't prevent it. It's a LEA decision. So LEAs would have to. So LEAs are control their own personnel in the IEP system. They add them. They withdraw or remove them when they leave the system. So yeah, we're happy if they include the paraprofessionals, but we don't require it, nor do we prevent it.
Well, it is 6 o'clock. This is a very engaging meeting. The active participation was awesome. We are going to make sure that those of you in the room that you turned in Post-it notes, we will add them to the Padlet. We will make sure that all of the ideas and recommendations from today's meeting are added and reflective in what folks talked about today. There's some good ideas that we've generated today that I believe we can start to massage into recommendations. So thank you all for an engaging meeting. Carmen's going to give us our charge for next steps.
So really quickly, our next meeting is on November 1st, also here or virtual. We have the guiding question narrated here. How can general and special education be more effectively integrated so that the instruction and built-in supports in general ed can better meet the needs of students, resulting in fewer referrals and identification? And we wanted you to know that forthcoming, we're hoping by close of business on Monday, you will have a summary document with some takeaways from this meeting. We will provide you with the data that was requested at the previous meeting and some of the analysis of that data. And we intend to have some reading recommendations for the next meeting as well. The next slide shows you just some of the topics that we'll be addressing as we move forward, and the final slide gives you our meeting dates through the end of May. So December is a month that we decided not to have a meeting on the last Wednesday of the month, but other than that, there's one every month.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.